So I want to continue on with the presentation I was giving the other day, yesterday, just to make sure that we get all this basic stuff around internet regulation right. Then what I want to do is let you have some time again working in your groups to just consolidate what it is that you've got to get done by next week. And then if we have time, I will start on what's next. I don't actually remember off the top of my head what I've decided. Actually, I might not have decided what's next because I've got to work out this one. So we talked about domain names generally, and I want to just really explore the extent to which a domain name is personal property. And we did sort of touch on this because I think the situation is analogous when we're looking at ownership of social media sites, for example, by businesses. And this is the space that we need to start in. Sorry, I'm just closing the door because of the choir. All right, so let's just continue on from where we were. So one of the things that's really interesting for just about everything that I can tell you about how the internet works, I can find a corresponding judge who has written it down in case. And in this case, so I've got these here on the presentation. I haven't put them in the reading because they're not really creating law, they're not making any particular added benefit. Somebody wrote to me, by the way, before we started asking if they should buy a particular textbook because this subject has no textbook. I can't remember who it was, but they'd been offered a book second-hand, $80, and I said, well, it's a bit out of date and you can buy it new for $75, so why would you? Was that you? So, 67. Sorry? 67 bucks. See, I found you a bargain. And did you buy it?
I did.
You did.
Yeah.
It's actually a really good textbook. That's why I was hoping you were here so you could remind me what the name of it is. It's like Internet and E-commerce Law or something. It's a big blue tome. It's not available online. If you can find it in the library, it is substantially out of date though. I think it's like 2009 or 2011, something like that. Yeah. The reason I mention it is it's actually quite a good text in the sense that every statement that it makes about how the internet works or what the law is or like even this stuff about that I'm just going to talk to you about now, and I've drawn on that particular textbook to do it, I'll admit, it will give you a case with a judge that basically says, this is how the DNS servers work. This is, so it's quite a good resource that way. I'm a little bit lazy, as you probably worked out, and I don't particularly like physical textbooks because I don't like carrying them around. I don't like what they do to the environment. I'm really good at losing stuff. And it's actually a physical textbook. I'm not aware of an online version, although I believe it is being updated and will be available online shortly. And if that's the case, and if this subject continues, then I probably would prescribe it as a text. There are a few other texts that are around, just as a little aside, for people who just feel more comfortable reading what serious, earnest and intelligent scholars say about the cases and the law. I'm often one of those. I would usually prefer to read a text than read a case, but I like a good story, so that's the way I work, each to their own. There are two texts with Margaret Jackson as the principal author. So Margaret Jackson is actually the person who delivered this course last in 2012. I've never met her, but she was the previous head of school at GSBL. She must have just finished that role around the time that I was employed, so I've not actually met her. At the same time, she has been a bit of a pop star in the field for a very long time, and for anybody who's actually interested in working in practice, there's a text that she wrote, started back in the 90s, called Technology Contracts, which I still think is the best contract textbook that you can get. Like, it's focused on writing technology contracts. It's written very much from the point of view of people who want to write contracts that already understand how a contract is formed and all the rest of it. But it's a really good, easy to use, practical, useful resource. You know, you're not going to sit there, you know, lying awake at night worrying about whether or not Justice Fin is correct and good faith in contracts should continue or not, but you will actually be able to get your work done quicker, which is why I like it. So she's the named author on 2 other texts. One is called Law in a Digital World. Ben, sorry.
What was her name again?
Margaret Jackson. While you're Googling there, you might be able to check for me. There's one with Marie, that I'm telling you the right thing. One with Gordon Hughes, which is something, it's got the words digital life or something like that in the title. Gordon Hughes is going to come and visit us next time round. Gordon is a partner with Davies, Collis and Kay. I've not actually ever met him in person, but he's one of the authors of that book with Margaret Jackson. So a much more academic type guest presenter than you've had previously. And he'll actually be talking about contracting, in particular focusing on a relatively recent US case involving Uber and the use of click to accept contracting, which I think will be a really interesting case study. So that Digital Life book, again, I think that's 2011. That's one of the reasons I thought it's a little bit out of date for what we're doing, and but it is very much focused on the evolution of privacy law, and I think is quite interesting. He doesn't know this, but I was one of the reviewers on that text before it went out, so I had some input into how it goes together. Then there's a slightly more recent one, which is about electronic information and the law, which is Margaret Jackson and Marita Shelley are the authors of that. So I wouldn't suggest you buy any of those, although if you can buy it new cheaper than you could buy it second hand, like it's like buy one get one free. Sorry, what was that?
175 or $200.
Yeah, you probably don't want to spend that. They are in the library, and both of the Margaret Jackson ones are available as electronic copies. I don't know if we have those in the library or not. I suspect not. Wouldn't be a bad thing for a few people to request it and ask why it's not there as an e-loan, because that might help us get some copies of it made available, because both of them are really good resources.
I think we have to notify the lecturer, at least that's what the library told us a couple of days ago, the civil procedure book.
Really? Okay, I'll talk to the library again.
You can also talk to Jenny Hurley at the library, because she's pretty cool about buying stuff.
Yeah.
Like if you say this would be really useful to have. I think she's really
And Jenny's the person that I'm speaking to. I will do my best to actually create a subject page for this course as well by the time you start your research projects. We haven't kind of started on that. That's a problem with sessionals. Anyway, that's between me and my union. All right, so that was a long-winded explanation. I've got case references for a number of these things, as you should seek out as well. If I don't suggest you read the case, you probably don't need to read the case, but you will find if for whatever reason these areas are relevant to your research or your report or your presentation, you might find them useful to follow through. So why I've got this here is I want to just make sure that we're all clear on the different parts of a domain name. So this bit here, the AU, is what's called the TLD, or the top level domain. So everything with the .au is administered through Australia's domain name registries. Initially, up until 2002, that was Melbourne IT, but since then there's been competition in that space, and there are many registrars, including more recently overseas registrars, who have licenses to distribute domains and register domains within their AU top level domain. The second part of this, so happy with my clicker when it works. is what's called the 2LD or the second level domain. In this case we've got edu.au, but that could be com, could be a range of different things. Okay, so these are just parts of how the internet knows how to find the particular URL. It goes to this set of registries first, then to the edu registries. Now what's interesting about edu is not anybody can use one. So you can only register an edu if you are an educational institute. So you will find sometimes, particularly what's happening over the last couple of years when there's been a lot of deregulation in the education sector, particularly TAFE or vet education, you'll find that there are all sorts of providers that will be, you know, like victoriaedu.com.au. You know, they'll put the edu in their name in some way. So, and I think that's interesting because it's demonstrating how actually part of the domain is becoming part of the way we think about how businesses are run, even if it's intuitively.
Sorry, with ones where they just have .com, is the presumption then that the top level domain would be like United States? Or is that...
The presumption is, so the .coms are still the most valuable. So, and initially they did come out of the United States, or they do technically, that's where that register is in the United States, but they did not have the same levels of constraints that Melbourne IT started out with and that still continue in Australia today, although they have tightened up over time. So to get a .au, right from the very beginning, you needed to satisfy the criteria we were talking about yesterday. It needed to be your own name, your company's name, you needed to have the trademark, or it needed to be substantially similar in some way. Where in the States and with the .com, there were no similar restrictions. You applied for something and you got it. If nobody else had it. The criteria initially is nobody else has it. And then you had these issues as people were either cyber squatting, thinking of great names that they thought might be valuable in the future and holding on to them, or identifying entities that didn't have websites yet that they knew were going to need them in some way. Also here, just in Australia's had a lot less issues with what's called typo squatting. So because there are prohibitions against registering misspellings of a word. So for example, one of the best known typo squatting cases was in the States where there was a in fact it was really a telephone number one, I think, but you could do for reverse charge calling. So I think the website was something like phone home with a PH. And so a rival, and I can't remember who it was, Bell Telco or whatever, and then one of the oppositions, let's call it Verizon or whatever, just went with phone home with an F. So Bell's doing, you know, telecommunication company number one is doing all the advertising of how you can use this particular site, and then people are just typing it in incorrectly and getting a whole different service provider. Similar things have happened, so, you know, people have tried to and failed to register Woolworths without, Woolworth.com with no S at the end, or Safeways with an S. Can't remember which way it went. So, so the constraints mean that those things have happened less often in Australia, but we still get some interesting cases nonetheless. And then the bit at the very top, the bit that's kind of unique to the organisation, that is what we call the 3LD or the third level domain. So now these two within the organisation, once from a registry point of view, that's all you need. But organisations can then create sub-sites within. So you will often see, I've been working recently with RMIT Online. So the selling part of the online postgraduate courses are actually being offered by a third party. It's all being coordinated by somebody else, and you can find them on studyonline.rmit.edu.au because a part of the domain has been provisioned off by the university for that third party to use for that purpose. So often you'll see domain names that extra dot. It's not a separate domain name, it's a separate provisioning within the domain. Okay, so essentially, we talked about this before, domain names, the web was really just a way that people could use a language to find what they were looking for instead of putting in numbers. But of course, most people who use the internet by number don't actually use a Roman alphabet and don't actually speak English. So it's kind of interesting that it was only in 2010 that ICANN started provisioning for non-ASCII script domain names, or being able to work in script that wasn't Roman script. And I find that really interesting, given particularly the growth of the use of the internet, what we now call the Arab Spring, the growth of the use of the internet in China, and that kind of the democratization that comes from the use of or the availability of scripts other than English. So yes, and so that you know, if it's not in Roman script, it's referred to as an IDN, or an internationalized domain name. It effectively works the same way. It allows for the translation into those numbers. So let's talk about what I want to talk about here, is whether a domain name is or is not personal property. Because we do talk about the domain or the website belonging to the company. And I don't think there's any argument that to the extent that a website itself represents property, it's copyright material, that it does belong to the organisation. It's usually hosted on an organisation's own servers or on servers that they rent for that purpose. But the domain name itself is actually just a licence. So domain name registrars issue the domains, register the domains on a register is simply that, a list, and they provide them subject to terms and conditions for a specified period. So as a consequence, they are universally, in Australia at least, universally in Australia makes no sense. They have been until relatively recently universally, but in Australia there doesn't seem to be any indication that this will change, considered not to be property. So they are a licence, and it's a licence of a service. So the extract on the screen comes from the AUDA policy rules for second level domains and says there are no proprietary rights in the domain name system. A registrant does not own a domain name. Instead, the registrant holds a licence to use a domain name for a specified period of time and under certain terms and conditions. As a consequence, in theory, second level domains can't be bought and sold freely. However, we're all aware that there is a secondary market for them. So does this matter? Does it matter whether or not a domain is property or not? Where can you see this being an issue? In commerce? In, like, the Vibe?
Yeah, the Marbo.
The Marbo.
When you sell a company's IP, these are exclusively offered as part of the registry of those assets. They're treated as assets in commercial transactions.
Commercial people do think of them as assets. So commercial people want to know that if I'm going to take all of that intellectual property, I'm also going to get your website and the ability to use it without interference. But actually, what they need to do is get a transfer of the registration of the website. Now, in practice, that is rarely an issue, but it could be. And there have been cases, particularly where, because the license is granted for a period of time, if the license lapses and somebody else gets in first, where there can be an issue with that. So, let me give you a case. I'll give you a case in a minute. So, in order to actually transfer a license or to get a domain in the first place, the applicant, the new registrant, needs to meet the eligibility criteria. So in relation to .com.au and .net.au, that means that you have to fit within those categories, or at least one of those categories. So we spoke about that before. It needs to be your own name, your corporation's name. So when you're thinking about the actual mechanics for a sale of business, for example, you need to be able to ensure that when the transfer of the intellectual property, so the trademarks, occurs, that you're also dealing with the transfer of the domain. So particularly with a sale of business, which is generally the transfer of a whole heap of contractual rights and property rights. With a sale of a company, it's a different issue. Why would that be? I don't need a confusion meter, I'm seeing so many frowns. So why, Marcus, do you think it might be different if I'm selling a business from selling a company?
A company could be called something that's the same as a trading name in a particular state. Both are technically eligible to have it, but they may go on the fact that one was started incorporated earlier than the other one, and then that one wins.
Can I circle back to that kind of scenario? I just want to really talk about a really basic scenario. Me, Catherine Nolan, trading as Nolan Legal. I provide legal services. I have the domain. I actually have nolanlegal.com, I think, because... Oh no, I do have .com.au. I decide that I'm just like being a teacher way too much, so I am going to sell my legal practice such as it is. There you go, Jamal's got his hand up. He can buy my legal practice. You know, I'm making a profit, you're going to buy it for a buck. And you know, the vast wealth of web traffic that comes to my much neglected website, you're very keen to make sure that you get that. Now I'm Catherine Nolan trading as Catherine Nolan, as Nolan Legal. So I have the website nolanlegal.com.au. Jamal, how am I going to be able to transfer that to you? What are you going to need to do? Have you got an idea?
Transfer the license.
And I would need to transfer the business name as well. Okay. In order for you to meet the eligibility criteria, you would need to take, now, Nolan Legal is obviously not my name. It's closely associated with my name, but it's not my name. So the law of Victoria says you can't trade in a name that is not your own unless you have you've registered your business name. These days you do that with ASIC. I think that's been happening for about the last 2 years. It used to be through the Victorian government that you did that. So you could, presumably, I think because you're not qualified, the Law Institute might have an issue. You might have a number of different problems here, but you could trade as Nolan Legal, and if you had that business name, then you've got something to show the registry that could be transferred to you. Just say, instead, the scenario is this. I incorporate a company. I might be the sole shareholder of that. I might have 15 shareholders. It's called Nolan Legal Proprietary Limited. It is the registrant of the domain name nolanlegal.com.au. And again, same scenario, I'm sick of doing it, I don't want to do it anymore, so I'll be the sole shareholder for the moment. I'm going to sell all of my shares to Jamal. What does he need to do to make sure that he owns the business name? That he owns the domain? Nothing. Anything other than nothing? That is a very bizarre... Mark, are you going to...
You do a deed of assignment so that you can protect yourself. So that even if there's no consideration, you've got a document that transfers the deed from one to the other, and then you have to register it depending on the new company name or the new entity name.
Well, is there a new company or entity? That's the thing. I'm selling in my shares.
That's very true.
Yeah, just to be clear, is he the director of this new entity as part of that share transfer agreement?
I don't know, it's up to him. I've sold him the shares.
the company owns.
He's now the majority shareholder. He can call an AGM and he can, in fact, most likely in a normal scenario, if I really was selling out, one of the completion events would be me resigning as a director and now the new shareholders appointing whoever they like.
You don't have to do anything because the relationship with Allocation with the company.
Exactly. Companies have separate legal personality. So there's no reason to change that. There's nothing that needs to happen. What if on the next day after I've sold him that company, he changes the name to Jamal Legal Proprietary Limited? What happens then? How does that affect his domain name?
This .com that I showed name challenge.
Could be challenged. So maybe the next week after selling him, because you know that much neglected website is a gold mine, Jamal. You've got yourself a bargain there. I then go and set up shop again as Nolan Legal. Maybe without the gap. Maybe my business name in going forward would be Nolan Space Legal. Different. Or even I just might be trading a sole practitioner, Catherine Nolan. But I might be able to say, well, it's actually a name that is very similar to my surname. It describes what I do. I can then go and challenge the domain at that stage. So as lawyers, we need to be thinking about what our clients need with the domain, how they're planning to use it. And it might be that Jamal, you know, smart man, he's bought my legal practice here. That probably shows he's not that smart, but smart enough. He is planning to call it Jamal Legal from this point forward, and his entire plan was to just redirect any traffic that was looking that way into his new website, the new domain. And he'd probably do some work on some SEO. Does anybody know what SEO stands for? Search it. So to make sure that people who were searching for me would find him instead. And we can talk about what that means. He might just do that anyway and not pay me my dollar for my shares. I don't know. So you do need to think about what the legal structure is and think about the eligibility, because it's not something that is necessarily going to transfer. So license, it's in contract. If you buy a company, then the contracts that the company is a party to will flow with that purchase. But if you're buying a business, then exactly as Mark said, all of the contracts that are with the former business owner, whether that's a company, partnership, trust, individual, need to be either assigned or novated. Usually if they matter, you need to novate them into the purchaser. So, and that means, again, putting our contract hats on, we need to think about whether or not there are obligations that are being transferred, because obligations themselves aren't transferable without the consent of the beneficiary, because otherwise you have a failure of consideration. In relation to the .asn.au and .org.au, there are slightly different eligibility criteria. Has anybody even seen a .id.au? So .ad.au is the second and third level domains for personal websites. So in theory, CatherineNolan.id.au should be my personal website. People aren't using them. Elise?
Would you be better off just going elisedigital.com rather
Probably,
than going
because you could go to GoDaddy and get that for like
So,
$5 without any protection, and that's so. Yeah, I have a CatherineNolan.com for no reason at all.
to protect yourself, your own name or whatever.
Yeah, in theory, like it's sitting there on GoDaddy, so anybody could hack into it. Really, That's not a challenge, by the way. So. Again, this is what I hate about working with slides. They go in a straight line, my brain doesn't. So we've spoken about this stuff before. domain's name need to either exactly match or be an acronym or an abbreviation of the name of the registrant or their trademark, or otherwise be closely and substantially connected.
What about with domain names where, for example, we actually register domain names that have to do something to do with our business, so that competitors or people who are against what we do can't then register those domain names that we
We're going to talk about the sucks domains in a minute, so can we come back to that question, because I think you'll have some good stories for us just somehow. I love it when people are in class work in controversial areas. So where a lot of the cyber squatting issues have come up have been in the States where the constraints have been more significant. Just trying to have a look here to see if there's anything here that we've missed. There have been disputes around a whole heap of different types of names, and on the whole, they've been, well, mostly when somebody's name, so for example, the Julia Roberts, John Cruise and Jim Carrey are all examples of names that somebody else used, and each of those celebrities took the path of bringing an action to get the name transferred back to them, and they were able to do so.
So if your name was Tom Cruise and you had .id.au, you're like, well, I'm an Australian person, this is my name.
See, I think actually that example, the tomcruise.id.au, I think it would be very difficult for Tom Cruise, the believer in Scientology, to actually come and stop you.
Well, because he wouldn't meet the criteria.
Because he wouldn't meet the
registration.
.id.au. But tomcruise.com, the anti-Scientology site, he may have had a little bit more influence over. Since 2008, registrants can offer domain name licenses for transfer and to transfer them for any reason to an eligible entity. Again, eligibility criteria continue. So the person needs to be eligible to hold that domain name license. So again, when you're doing transfers of business, looking at the completion events and saying, okay, what do we need to happen at the point of time that that ownership changes? And I would suggest by analogy that you need to also, or lawyers need to also be thinking about social media sites, etc. So an area that's been particularly troubled by this is Twitter, which has no constraints at all. So the handle you use on Twitter can be anything that you like. Hence the proliferation of, the real Donald Trump, the real whoever it is.
His name is Mike Pence. As it isn't actually Mike Pence. He keeps getting tagged in things that are aimed at the vice president-elect. And he's like, it's not me, leave me alone.
And that sort of must have come out of the blue too. Well, I don't know, but I've not heard about Mike Pence until he became a candidate.
Because he has one that was for when he was the governor of Illinois.
Oh, right.
Yeah, but that was like Governor Mike Pence.
Yeah, it would be very unfortunate, really, isn't it, to have that. So, we've established that they're not personal property, but can they be tangible property of some sort? There is no doubt that domain names, particularly .com names, have significant value. The market globally for domain name sales is in the order of $2 billion a year. Pre-2008, it was around $2.5 billion. And had been growing very rapidly up until the GFC. It seems to have settled a bit. Combination of things is, one is people just aren't throwing money around in the way that they used to in 2008 and prior, but also that there have been more constraints built into the .com system over more recent times. So in this case, Capital Web Works and AdultShop.com Limited, federal court said that the applicant in that case, so actually let me give you the facts of that case. This isn't your case, is it, Marcus? sound like it might be slightly similar facts from what you're talking about. So the applicant here had registered a domain name, adultshop.com.au, for the use in retailing adult products. For reasons that I don't think are clear in the judgment, they let the domain name lapse. And then so the respondent, in this case, a company called adultshop.com Limited, registered the name subsequently. And so Capital Web Works argued that by using that name, the trading name that it had, as a domain name, that it was essentially passing off, and that it was misleading and deceptive. Well, its use was misleading and deceptive under what was then Section 52 of the Trade Practices Act. And so the court then found that the applicant held the name on the terms and conditions of the contract, and the contract itself suggests that anyone holding a domain name would be unlikely to see it as the vehicle to ownership of long-term goodwill. Okay, it's 16 years ago, that case. Do you think that we feel the same way now, that ownership of a domain name is not associated with long-term goodwill? I reckon the first time I used the internet was about 97. I was a bit of a late adopter. But I know I think I said this the other day, I judge technologies by, did we use them a lot before my children were born or not? My youngest son was born in 99, and my criteria for him is, before he was born, people didn't have personal email addresses. If you had an email address, it was likely to be a work address, and you didn't access email outside of your workplace on the whole. I mean, obviously there are people who that was not the case. Marcus?
I mean, when the domain names first started, the algorithms for search were different. So you'd have but now because of SEO, you're either going to have clients know you, so it doesn't really matter what your domain is. If you've got good SEO, it doesn't matter if you've got a good search domain name or not. So the value is sort of less now.
And it's frustrating when you put in a domain name and you get something else, because we're all just using, well, maybe we're not, but I'm using Google in my address bar. So I go to look for the domain and I'm getting something else, and that's somebody else's, usually a competitor. That's SEO. But
I think the decision is plainly wrong by today's standards, if I'm interpreting it correctly.
so, and I'm not passing judgment as to whether it's right or wrong. I am asking the question about whether we would look at it from the same perspective now, with this long-term understanding.
You might have a domain name and you want to try and keep it safe because that's where people know how to find you. Like having all the law firms work in Collins Street or whatever. Like that perception about where things are, that's where you are on the internet. If you're not there and somebody else is there,
it's like saying if RMIT can turn around and go, RMIT.edu.eu doesn't matter, I'm just going to call it now. Something else. People will figure it out.
Technical perspective as well, the historic body of links that point to that site are tantamount to the construction of value, which would mean that there's a clear association of long-term ownership with Google. It actually equals something physically to perception.
Well, and I would argue too that using that kind of logic, a trademark.
Yeah.
Trademark has a fixed period of time as well, unless you renew. A patent actually has a fixed period of time by which it actually expires and runs out. Yet we very much think of those as assets and part of the goodwill. And goodwill really is from an accounting sense, the difference between the value of the assets and what the company is worth. I mean, that's the difference, is the goodwill when you think about it. And one of the things that we've seen over the last decade is this massive growth, if you look at share price, in a differential between physical assets and the actual value of shares.
A third of Donald Trump's proposed wealth is based on the perceived value of his name as a brand.
But he's got a really good name. It's like a great name. It's a really big name, and you can say that it's a very good name.
He's estimated it's worth at $3.3 billion US.
3.3 billion US dollars.
He's got a lot of goodwill in his goodwill.
So,
Did he do that himself?
Yeah. No one else is auditing his financial records, so.
Linda.
Similar to like, I'm not sure if you heard, but in like Oakley there was this cafe that was called the Fat Duck, and just before his son came down to open his Fat Duck restaurant, he made the cafe change its name. Similar, let's just say that cafe had its own IP address, registered as .com.au.
I don't know that that's, again, I have a bit of a girl crush on Heston Blumenthal as well, so, you know, I'm going to have to go and find out a little bit more about that. But, yeah, so do you know anything, like when you say made, did he make an application through legal process, or did he make them an offer they couldn't refuse?
I don't know, but all I knew was that cafe had to change its name, and they made a massive deal because they put all these newspaper on their shops, and then the next day they changed their names.
They changed the name.
Yeah.
Okay. I'd like to find out more about it, because my guess is that that would be a commercial arrangement, that they changed their name because it was made worth their while in a particular set of circumstances. And it'd be interesting to look at whether they had a website, email addresses, all of those things beforehand. But yeah, a really good example. I just don't know about it, but I did like that SBS show that talked about it. So examples of successful applications under the transfer process, where names have been registered and somebody else claiming rightful ownership has successfully claimed. So some American ones that really stood out: iPods, GoDaddy, and I think GoDaddy is quite amusing, given that GoDaddy themselves are a DNS, or a domain name registrar, I should say, and Sony Z5. The well-known trademark owners in each of those cases were successful, but in Australia there's quite a long list of them. But Telstra Online, Holden Astra, Tina Arena, Napoleon Purtis, SanDisk. The one that amuses me the most, and that's why I've actually given you, knowing that there are some LSS members here and liking to get involved in a little bit of argy-bargy with the university when I can. This actually goes back to 2004, but the Melbourne University Students' Society, or Student Union, registered unimel.com.au. Ultimately, the University of Melbourne was successful in getting that name transferred back to them, but yeah, you got to admire the chutzpah there. I like it. So this is, I talked to Jamal was just raised an issue before. So some of the, again because of the constraints that have been applied from the beginning in Australia, there's been less of it here. But there's been quite a lot of litigation in the States and in Canada as well around what we call the sucks cases. So usually websites that are started by activists or people who just don't like a service, who've created, like in the case of Walmart, Walmart sucks. Or is it, yeah, Walmart Canada sucks, that particular one. So the question, and there's two schools of thought here. So roughly 2/3 of the cases say, actually this could be misleading and deceptive. That people might be confused and think that this is Walmart, and that can be deceptive. Yeah, and I'm not kidding, 2/3 of the cases, roughly. Where there is another third that say, well, this is actually free speech. Now, these coming from an American or North American context where there is a right of free speech, but judges, and I must admit I'm sit on their side saying nobody is actually fooled into thinking that Walmart Canada sucks is actually a website that is being operated by Walmart Canada. It is quite clearly either a spoof or a protest site that people need to have their, they need to be fair, they need to be careful not to defame someone or libel someone, but at the end of the day they have the right to say the things that they want to say. So what's been your, sorry Elise?
Unless it's sold Walmart branded vacuum cleaners or something.
Yeah, well, again, I don't think in this case it did. And as many of you probably know, there's been, Walmart has been under some considerable fire. Bernie Sanders in particular is not a fan of Walmart. And there's been some really interesting stuff that's come out, particularly, so those of you who are interested in the CSR space might have seen some of the information that comes out. So Walmart notoriously pays its staff members very low wages, and most of, well, a large proportion of Walmart staff below the poverty line, at which point they have the right to get food stamps. And Walmart itself processes more food stamps than any other single organisation in the United States. So there's this perpetuation of this cycle, and Bernie Sanders and a group of his people did essentially some economic analysis that showed what the difference to the US economy would be if Walmart paid its staff an extra $1 an hour, with the reduction in the food stamps and also the other thing there is Walmart is essentially owned by one family. The amusingly called Walton family, so it's very much a goodnight John Boy kind of experience. But what's been your experience, Jamal, here? Because you've had protest sites set up, have you, or in Australia or elsewhere, do you know?
We've actually had copycat African tech handle in Twitter. That was interesting.
Okay.
But
Can you tell us about that? Are you happy to share it? Or?
Share that. So we are with our clinics. We run a called Dr. Mari clinics in Australia. That's where they're branded and we're trademarked. We have a business name there. And we've got Dr. Mari Twitter handle. There's an African copycat which essentially said called himself Dr. Mari, so it's a very similar naming and use our logos, everything. And essentially looking
So are they
our website.
selling similar services, or are they a
So what happens
protest?
in Africa is no, they're actually selling similar services. What happens in Africa is there's black market for medical pills, and they get customers to go to them rather than the proper proprietor. So whether those drugs are actually real or not, or what's going on, that's what they do. And there's a problem in Africa, and we've got a problem in our clinics in Africa because of that, because there's a lot of copycats. So they're actually copying an Australian brand, or our Australian arm, potentially getting women to order maybe drugs off the internet to get drugs into the mail, which is a problem that does happen in Australia as well. So they can't get through customs sometimes. In this case, we actually very nicely continue to bombard this Twitter handle on an ongoing basis until they have actually finally.
So kind of the reverse of a denial of service attack by actually just continuing to bombard them with messages.
That's correct, yeah. But what we do in Australia is register different things, for example, around emergency contraception clinics, contraception services, counselling, etc. Because you do have parties who are anti, who might register a web domain name on the pretense of supporting women, but actually then guide them towards their services, run their thoughts around not providing services. So it's kind of, we try and keep registered number of different domain names that might otherwise be used for that purpose.
So, and not necessarily be using them.
Yes,
That-
right.
yeah.
And they just
So that's part of a domain name strategy, which, yeah, perfectly valid strategy, and people who sit on the other side of the fence from your organisation, you know, could well be store housing others for exactly the same reason. Yeah. James?
What about the political protest websites? And the political party or the political person who transfer those to themselves?
So political websites, sorry, your voice is very quiet, there's a hum here. So political websites that in relation to a political party or protest or, well, as again, in Australia you still need to meet the eligibility criteria. So, you know, youngliberals.org.au would need to be run by the Young Libs. The younglibsuck.org.au is actually under Australian rules probably quite difficult to get, because unless you are associated with the trademark and the domain, couldn't get there.
What about if you were like part of a club or an incorporated association that had that name?
I think actually to get Young Libs Suck as an incorporated association name would actually be quite difficult of its own anyway, but you know, maybe. And it might be that, you know, it's libertarians or something else. I shouldn't be picking on I'll pick on, you know, the Labor Party next or something. But, so it's a little bit harder under the Australian context, but it's certainly not impossible. And you would be seeing similar sorts of things with Twitter handles, Facebook pages. I don't know whether you can do that on a Pinterest site, but I'm sure that you can. So you still need to meet the eligibility criteria. But I am interested in this, really this way that the two lines of cases are going. So I've given you here Bosley and Kramer, which is the freedom of speech. And actually I think that's a reproductive rights case from memory as well. So where these cases that are talking about, like Walton's, which are saying that in that case the name was removed because they were working on the passing off argument. And to me, I mean, I look at that and I think that just seems patently wrong to me, that it just doesn't feel like there's any kind of passing off or association. Obviously, you know, I'm not an American lawyer. I don't understand how those things work in the same way as I do under the Australian system. But I also think that shows, particularly these early cases, how a lack of understanding by the courts of how the technology works and is used. Because let's face it, you don't need to know anything about technology to use a website or a domain name. But a lack of understanding about how they're being used in society has led to this kind of stream of cases. And then the way that precedent works, so you're then stuck with a line of cases that may not actually make a great deal of sense. And it requires some fairly radical judges to take things to the next step. Last slide for here, some fairly recent-ish developments. And which I think is taking things in a more realistic way in some cases. As is often the case, Canada seems to come up with some really interesting things here. So a Canadian court has recognised a domain name as being personal property. And there are a couple of cases here, the Mould case and the Two Cows cases, where essentially the court has recognised the ongoing validity or the ongoing asset value of a domain name to an organisation. So, is there anything in particular in the facts here that The other thing that has happened more recently is ICANN opening up. When I say more recently, we're talking 5 or 6 years now, but again, the internet is becoming part of an institution as well, is this opening up of top-level domains in a way that hasn't happened before. So some of the first range that came out in 2012 included names like Google, Amazon, Toyota. So where global businesses could have their own top-level domain. But again, with significant restrictions, really following the Melbourne IT model in relation to the allocation of those. So those of you who've done property law will be well aware that Australia has led the world with the Torrens title with the introduction of an Australian system essentially for registering land. And so many people see the work that Melbourne IT did very early on in the process of registering domains names as sort of the next generation of Torrens, of actually setting up a set of requirements and rules under which people could play in this space in a meaningful and real way. And we don't have huge numbers of disputes in the way that they do in other jurisdictions as a consequence. Whether that's the case or not, I don't know. But that's all I really had to say about regulating the internet. I guess the takeaway piece is there is no owner of the internet. There is no one governing body. That there really is a network of interconnected, self-organising not-for-profits that are really organising. It's been driven by the technology and the use as opposed to a legal structure. And legal structures are sitting behind it. And you can find, as I mentioned before, a case for pretty much any statement I make about the internet and how it works. There will be a judge who has had to write down how it works at some point in some sort of dispute. But that is responding to how the internet has grown. It's not a legal system that has been developed for that industry to grow into.